On a winter morning in 1901, deep in the Appalachia Mountains, snow fell thick over the narrow path, leading to an old, weathered cabin. Mary Ann Walker stood alone on the porch, her bruised hands clutching the thin fabric of her dress, her swollen belly unmistakable beneath the worn cloth. She watched as her father's wagon disappeared around the bend, without a backward glance, without a single word of farewell. The cabin door creaked open. A stranger stood there, filling the doorway. His pale gray eyes swept over her, as cold and sharp as the mountain wind. He spoke only one sentence, his voice gravelly, more command than question. "You coming in, or planning to freeze out here?" Mary Ann drew a long breath and stepped across the threshold. Only when the door shut firmly behind her did she realize this wasn't just another harsh winter. It was the beginning of an entirely different life. Harlan, Kentucky, January 1901. The gray sky hung low over the peaks of the Appalachia like a heavy, soiled blanket. Snow had fallen through the night, blanketing the narrow mountain road in silence. The wooden wheels of the old wagon creaked and ground against the packed snow, each turn slow and deliberate. Mary Ann Walker sat in the back of the wagon, her hands tied tightly in front of her, wrists swollen and raw. Every jolt of the wagon sent a sharp pain through her shoulders, but she didn't make a sound. Her blank eyes stayed fixed on her bare, frozen feet, and the tears on her cheeks had already turned to ice. Beside her, her father, Charles Walker, held the reins with a face of stone. In nearly 3 days of climbing into the mountains from Harlan, he had spoken only 12 words. "You brought this on yourself. Now live with it." But she hadn't brought it on herself. She was just a 17-year-old girl who had believed the honeyed words of William Grant, the son of the wealthiest banker in town. He had promised her everything, whispered sweet lies in the dark. But when her belly began to swell, and her father's jaw began to clench with rage, William disappeared, leaving her alone with her shame. The night she confessed, her father's face had darkened like a storm. The next morning, before sunrise, he had stormed into her room, tied her hands, dragged her out of bed, and ignored her mother's sobs. Now, after 3 days of silence and snow, the wagon stopped before a lonely wooden cabin, halfway up the mountain. Snow draped the roof in thick sheets, and wind howled through the cracks of the rough boards like a mournful song. The door opened. A towering man stepped out, his face hidden in beard and shadow. He wore a heavy leather coat, and his pale gray eyes fell on her with no warmth at all, only something hard and cold, like stone. Charles jumped down first, grabbed her shoulder, and yanked her out like a sack of grain. He threw her into the snow at the man's feet, spitting words through clenched teeth. "You're filth. I won't have you dirtying my house anymore." Then he turned to the stranger. $200 and the girl? She can cook, sew, she's healthy. Keep her until she delivers, and what you do with her after is your business. The child isn't yours to worry about. The man, Samuel Boone, pulled out his wallet and counted the bills with thick, calloused fingers, never once looking at her. When he finished, he said simply, "Fair enough." Charles tucked the money inside his coat, climbed back into the wagon. He didn't say another word to her. No instructions, no goodbye. He cracked the reins, and the wagon rolled away, leaving Mary Ann kneeling in the snow, hands still bound, belly tight and aching, and the sound of wheels fading into nothing. Only after the wagon was gone did Samuel finally speak. Standing in the doorway, he watched her for a long, silent moment before nodding toward the open door. "You coming in or planning to freeze out here?" Mary Ann bit her lip hard enough to draw blood, hiding her torn wrists behind her back. She forced herself to stand, one unsteady step at a time toward the porch. In her mind, a quiet, defiant promise took shape. "I won't die. Not here. Not today." When the cabin door shut behind her, the snow outside still fell heavy. The wind still howled through the pines. But inside, the only sound was the low crackle of the fire, and Samuel Boone's cold, unreadable eyes watching her from the shadows. Inside the cabin, the firelight cast a warm glow over the rough-hewn log walls, softening the bite of the Appalachia winter just a little. Marianne stood frozen in the doorway, her bloodied hands hovering at her waist. Samuel Boone walked past her, as if she were nothing more than a shadow, and went straight to the hearth, tossing 2 dry logs onto the glowing embers. "Untie yourself," he said, his deep, gravelly voice offering no more than an order. Marianne hesitated, then fumbled with the knot. When the rope finally fell to the floor, she drew in a shaky breath. Her wrists were sore and red, but at least they were free. The cabin was sparse and cold, with only a narrow bed in the corner, a rough wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, and shelves lined with jars and dry goods. Samuel stomped the snow from his boots, set his hat on the table, and looked at her with those cold gray eyes. "There's stew in the pot. Eat if you want. I won't have you fainting from hunger here." Marianne glanced toward the hearth. A pot hung above the flames, steam curling from its edges. Her stomach clenched, and for the first time in days she realized how desperately she needed food. She carefully ladled some into a wooden bowl, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Samuel replied, without looking at her. "Your father paid for you to stay here until the child comes. After that, we'll see if you're worth keeping around." The words landed on her like a stone. Marianne gripped her spoon tighter, but swallowed her pride. Tears wouldn't help her here. She knew that much already. She lifted her chin. Her mother's voice echoed faintly in her mind. "Be strong, no matter what." "I can work," she said, her voice shaky but clear. "I'm not afraid of hard work." Samuel's gaze flicked from her swollen belly back to her face. "We'll see," he murmured, before turning back to his fire, dismissing her as if she hadn't spoken. That first night passed in a terrifying quiet. Samuel had offered her the bed without ceremony, and claimed a bedroll near the fire for himself. There was no explanation, no kindness in the gesture, but also no malice. She lay on the thin mattress, listening to the sound of him snoring like a hibernating bear, the wind howling through the shutters, the snow piling against the door. She couldn't sleep. Her belly ached with every twist, reminding her she was no longer alone. There was a life growing inside her now. In the darkness, she whispered to it, "I promise, I'll find a way to give you a home. I won't give up." By morning, the weak winter light filtered through the frosted glass. Samuel was already up, the fire rebuilt, and the faint smell of coffee in the air. He placed a bowl of cornmeal porridge in front of her and nodded to the table. "Eat, then tidy up." "I'm no good at that." Marianne nodded, almost grateful for the task. Anything to keep her hands busy, her mind from drifting back to what she'd lost. All morning she worked. She opened dusty cupboards, inventoried the dry beans and jars, rearranged the pantry, scrubbed the grime from the table and the windows with a torn cloth. It felt strange to bring some semblance of order to the little cabin, but also strangely comforting. Sometime later, Samuel returned, snow clinging to his coat. He carried a brace of rabbits over his shoulder, hung them by the door, and muttered, "Storm's coming. Best be ready. We could be stuck in here a week." Marianne turned away so he wouldn't see the fear in her eyes. The cabin already felt like a prison, but at least it was a prison with a roof, with fire, and, so far, with a man who hadn't raised a hand to her. And for Marianne, that was enough. Enough to keep going one more day. On the third night, Marianne woke to a sharp, searing pain in her lower belly. At first, she thought it was just another cramp. But when her hand brushed the hem of her dress, she felt warmth, wet and spreading. Looking down, she saw dark, heavy stains blooming across the fabric. Her heart hammered, her breath broke into ragged sobs. No, not now." The baby had moved just yesterday, a small flutter that reminded her she wasn't completely alone. But now the blood wouldn't stop, and terror washed over her like an icy flood. She called out, her voice cracking, "Samuel!" He was up before she finished saying his name, striding quickly from his bedroll by the fire. His eyes hardened when he saw the blood. "Don't move. Lie flat. Breathe," he said, his deep voice steady, though his clenched jaw betrayed his tension. He helped her stretch out, sliding pillows under her legs, his movements quick and sure. Marianne stared at him, confused through her panic. How did he know what to do? Why was he so gentle? Samuel didn't answer her unspoken question. He opened a chest and pulled out clean cloths, a bottle of whiskey, and a basin of water. The fire roared as he added more logs, the smell of smoke and iron mingling in the room. "Hold this here. Press down. Keep breathing," he instructed, guiding her trembling hand over the cloth he'd placed against her stomach. She bit her lip and obeyed, fighting the urge to cry. In that moment she thought of her father, of his words. "This is God's punishment. You brought this on yourself." Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "Do you think the baby's a punishment?" Samuel's rough hands froze briefly on the bloodied cloth, and his eyes darkened. "Your father's a fool," he said, low and firm. "I don't believe any God worth praying to punishes a child for its parents' mistakes." The words dropped into the air like a stone, heavy but strangely warm, like the fire beside them. The bleeding didn't stop for hours. Through the long, cold night, Samuel stayed at her side, changing the soaked cloths, helping her drink, keeping the fire roaring. Not once did he leave her. Just before dawn, the flow of blood finally slowed. The pain dulled into shallow waves. In a fragile, fleeting moment, she felt a faint kick inside her belly. Tears sprang to her eyes, mixing with sweat as she whispered, It's still alive." Samuel nodded, the faintest softness in his steely gray gaze. "Yeah, still alive, but you stay down. Don't move, don't even think about it. You hear me?" She nodded weakly, and for the first time in days, her fingers found his, rough, calloused, but warm and steady. And she held on. As she drifted toward sleep, his voice rumbled low near the fire. "Don't believe what they told you. You're not some worthless thing to be sold off. You're worth more than any dollar that bastard took." And in that quiet, Marianne made a promise to her child. "I'll protect you. He will too. We'll survive this. Together." The blizzard raged for 3 days straight, burying the cabin under heavy, white silence. The log walls groaned against the wind, and the fire burned day and night to fight off the bitter Appalachian cold. Marianne stayed in bed just as Samuel had ordered. The cramps still came in waves, but the baby still stirred faintly inside her, a fragile sign it was still there. Every night she heard Samuel rise to tend the fire, to check on her, to change the bandages with the quiet care of a man who did what needed to be done. Somewhere in her fevered haze, she had begun to believe that here in this harshest of places, at least someone still thought her life worth saving. On the 4th morning, when the storm finally broke and the sky gleamed bright and silver, Samuel was splitting wood on the porch when he froze. His gray eyes narrowed, fixed on the slope below. Hoofbeats, faint but steady, carried up the mountainside. Marianne pressed herself to the window, holding her breath. A lone rider emerged through the icy mist, his outline growing sharper with every step. Her heart clenched. Brown hair tousled under a battered cap, a thin, familiar figure hunched in an oversized coat. It was Robert, her 15-year-old brother. For a heartbeat, the world tilted. He was here, astride a weary horse, thinner, paler than she remembered, but still the boy she'd once held through his own tears after their father's beatings. Samuel's hand moved to the rifle hanging by the door, his voice sharp but calm as he called out, "Stay where you are, boy. Who you looking for?" Robert reined his horse to a stop, his voice shaking but defiant. "I'm looking for my sister, Marianne Walker. They said you bought her." His gaze dropped to her swollen belly, and fury and grief burned in his young eyes. You really bought my sister, like she was livestock. Marianne stepped onto the porch, her voice breaking. Robert, it's me. He slid down from the saddle, stumbling through the snow toward her, his hand reaching for hers. He stopped short when Samuel stepped forward, his broad frame filling the doorway. Samuel's voice was low, not threatening, but unyielding. That boy yours? Marianne nodded, her breath uneven. Samuel stepped aside, jerking his chin towards the door. Then get him in here. Don't let him freeze to death out here. Robert hesitated, his glare still fixed on Samuel before stepping inside. The cabin fell silent, the fire popping in the corner. Marianne clutched her brother's hand, feeling both warmth and anguish at once. His grip was tight, as though afraid if he let go she would vanish again. His voice cracked with barely contained rage. I saw him take the money. I saw it. He sold you. Not for honor, not for the family. Just for money? The words hit like a hammer. She had spent days telling herself her father had done it out of shame, out of some twisted idea of righteousness. But looking into Robert's tear-filled eyes, she knew it had all been a lie. Her father had sold her. Plain and simple. Samuel sat down at the table, his gaze never leaving them. His words were blunt, but not cruel. If you want to take her back, boy, what's your plan? You got an empty house, debts piled high, and a baby coming any day now. You plan to feed her on good intentions? Robert's lips trembled, his young voice thick. I don't know, but I don't want her here. With you. Samuel huffed a dry laugh, shaking his head. At least you've got guts. But here she's safe. You don't know how many out there would tear her apart for nothing. He turned to Marianne, his gray eyes steady and quiet. Your choice. Stay or go. But if you stay, at least here you and that baby stand a chance. Marianne looked at her brother, then at the man who'd kept her alive through the storm. Her voice was soft but clear. Robert, I need time to think. Her brother's grip tightened, his voice breaking. You have to come home. We're family. She brushed his cheek with her fingers, her smile sad but resolute. Family isn't always blood, Robert. Sometimes, it's the ones who stay when you need them most. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and soundless, blanketing the porch. Inside, the fire cast its glow on the three of them, each lost in quiet thought. And Marianne knew sooner or later she would have to choose. But tonight at least they were here. Together, still alive. The snow had fallen for 2 more days, heavy and relentless, burying the mountain road back to town. Marianne was finally able to leave the bed, shuffling slowly around the cabin, though Samuel's voice still barked at her whenever she moved too fast. Don't push it. That baby's still weak. Robert had already fallen into the rhythm of life here. The boy helped Samuel split wood, dumped ashes from the hearth, and cleared out the old shed for a place to sleep. Though still wary of the mountain man, his eyes were no longer filled with the same sharp distrust. That morning, the sky was eerily clear after the storm, when Samuel froze in the doorway. His gray eyes narrowed like knives as he peered down the slope. Someone's down there, he muttered, his voice low and flat but carrying an unmistakable edge. He set his bowl aside and stepped out onto the porch. Marianne dropped her dough mid-kneed, pressing herself to the window. Below, 3 figures emerged from the tree line, moving slow and deliberate, keeping to the shadows like wolves stalking prey. Samuel pulled his rifle down from its hook and checked the chamber, the metallic clicks sharp in the quiet cabin. They've been out there an hour. Now they're coming up, he said evenly. Robert stepped out of the shed, gripping the old axe tightly. I can help. Samuel's gray eyes flicked toward him, then gave the slightest nod. Stay calm. Remember, don't swing unless they cross the door. Got it? Robert swallowed hard, but nodded. Got it. The sound of boots crunching snow grew closer. Then a smooth, oily voice called out from beyond the porch. Sorry to trouble you. Just looking for a place to stay the night. No harm. Samuel didn't move, his voice dry and hard as flint. Plenty of caves out here. Find one. A laugh answered, cold and mocking. We heard. You've got yourself a young lady in there. Knocked up, pretty thing. Shame for her to be all alone up here. Marianne's face flushed hot, her hands trembling as her stomach tightened. The baby inside her kicked restlessly, sensing her fear. Samuel's thumb cocked the rifle, his tone sharp enough to cut. First man through that door dies. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then the same mocking laugh. This time harder, meaner. You picked the wrong fellas to scare. A loud thud shook the door as someone kicked it. Robert flinched, ready to leap forward, but Samuel's hand shot out to hold him back. His eyes stayed fixed on the crack of light under the door, his finger steady on the trigger. Glass shattered in the back room. Samuel's head snapped toward it just as a man climbed through the shed window, a blade glinting in his hand. Robert yelled and swung the axe instinctively. Steel met flesh with a sickening crack. The man howled in pain, tumbling back out into the snow, leaving a dark smear behind him. Good boy, Samuel growled, his eyes still locked on the door as he fired a shot through the wood near one of the other men. The bullet split the timber, and the two remaining intruders cursed, retreating down the slope. Samuel kept his aim steady, waiting another few seconds before lowering the rifle. His voice was quiet and cold. They're still alive, but now they're scared. Marianne sat on the floor, clutching her belly, chest heaving with fear. Samuel reached down and gripped her arm, steady and firm. It's over. You're safe now. Robert leaned against the wall, still gripping the axe, pale but with a strange spark of pride in his eyes. His voice was hoarse, almost to himself. I couldn't let them hurt you. Samuel looked at him then, something shifting in his expression, an acknowledgement, almost a kind of respect, before turning back to Marianne. His tone softened but stayed sure. You're worth protecting. Both of you. Marianne felt his hand on her shoulder, strong and honest, the only thing standing between her and the cruel world outside. And for the first time since this all began, even with fear still curling in her chest, she felt something bright flicker to life. The fragile hope that maybe all she had endured had led her here for a reason. To find people willing to fight for her. The blizzard had passed days ago, but the cold still clung to the mountains, heavy and sharp. February dragged into its final weeks, and the air carried a damp chill that hinted at spring. In Marianne's belly, the baby grew heavier by the day, kicking so hard now she often had to grab the edge of the table just to steady herself. Samuel watched her quietly, his gray eyes betraying a flicker of worry, even though his voice stayed calm. It's close. Won't be much longer now. That morning, the sky was a dim slate gray, and snow drifted lazily through the air. Marianne was folding a blanket when a sudden searing pain gripped her lower belly, sharp enough to buckle her knees. She clutched at the bed frame, breath ragged, cold sweat breaking across her forehead. This pain was different, deeper, heavier, unrelenting. Samuel, she gasped, her voice weak and hoarse. He spun around, eyes snapping to her, immediately focused. He only needed a glance before he said, firmly, It's time. He moved quickly to her side, easing her down onto the bed. His voice dropped, steady and commanding. Robert, get in here! The boy came rushing in from outside, coat still half on, his face pale with panic. What's wrong? Samuel didn't even look up, barking orders as he worked. Water. Heat every pot we've got. Bring every clean cloth from the shelf. Move! Marianne panted, her skin damp with sweat as the pain began coming in relentless waves. Samuel supported her head, placing a cool cloth on her forehead, his gray eyes calm and unshakable. Breathe. You can do this. You're going to be fine. This is just how it begins. But it only got worse. Time blurred into a haze of fire and ice. Night fell outside, snow piled again against the door. Inside the cabin, the hearth glowed bright, steam and smoke filling the air. Robert kept running back and forth, bringing water, swapping out cloths, his voice breaking but determined. "You're strong. You've always been strong. You can do this." Marianne bit down hard, her knuckles white against the blanket. The pain was like waves crashing over her, each one pulling her deeper. Yet above it all, she still heard Samuel's voice beside her, low and steady. "You're stronger than you know. You've got this." At last, Samuel gave a faint nod, his voice dropping into quiet certainty. "I see the head. One more good push. Now!" Marianne cried out, summoning everything left inside her, and suddenly, through the agony, came a sharp, thin cry that cut through the storm outside. "She's a girl," Samuel murmured, his deep voice thick with something softer, almost reverent. He wrapped the tiny, red, wriggling child in a warm cloth and placed her on Marianne's chest. The baby was so small, her damp black hair clinging to her forehead, her little hands curling weakly. Marianne stared at her through tears, her voice cracking as she whispered, "Hello, my little girl." Robert leaned close, eyes wide in the firelight. What's her name?" Marianne looked down at her daughter, her voice quiet but certain. "Grace." "Her name is Grace." Samuel stood back, silent, his gray eyes fixed on them, a faint curve at the corner of his mouth, though his hand still trembled faintly. Marianne reached out, her fingers finding his sleeve, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Thank you for everything." His eyes met hers for a long moment before he finally said, slow and steady, "You and her deserve a chance. And I want to be the one to give you that chance. If you'll have me." Marianne closed her eyes, clutching the baby closer, feeling the tiny warmth seep into her chest. She already knew the answer. Here, with this man, this child, and her brother keeping watch outside, was the home she had always been searching for. Just weeks after Grace was born, spring began creeping down the mountains. The snow melted into thin streams that trickled down the slopes, and the sun broke timidly through the heavy gray clouds. Inside the cabin, Marianne was learning to stand again each morning, holding her daughter carefully despite the aches that still lingered in her body. Samuel quietly built her a new chair, sturdy and padded, and Robert transformed the shed into a proper little room for himself, with wooden toys Samuel had whittled for Grace on the shelf. The cabin, once cold and silent, now felt alive, warm with soft cries, quiet laughter, and the smell of cooking porridge. But that morning, when two men on horseback appeared at the crest of the hill, Marianne felt a chill climb her spine. Samuel had spotted them first, his hand resting casually on the rifle, his eyes narrowing. But when the lead rider dismounted, the badge on his worn coat glinted faintly in the pale light. The sheriff? And beside him, a weary-looking old preacher. Samuel lowered his hand and gave them a stiff nod. "Morning, Reverend." "Sheriff, you're early." The sheriff didn't waste words. He looked straight at Marianne, his voice serious but not unkind. "We're here because of something else. Something you need to know before the wedding." Marianne clutched Grace closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it?" The sheriff drew a breath. "Your father, Charles Walker. He was arrested 3 nights ago, caught trying to sell a 14-year-old girl to a mining camp outside Helena. We found his records when we brought him in." The blood rushed in Marianne's ears. Grace squirmed in her arms, letting out a soft little cry. The sheriff's voice lowered. "You weren't the first, Marianne. He's done this many times. At least a dozen girls. Pregnant, orphaned, desperate. He'd lure them in, then sell them off. 2 are confirmed dead, 3 more missing. And we only learned the full pattern because the girl we saved remembered hearing about a pregnant woman sold to a mountain man. That led us here. Marianne stood frozen. Samuel's steady hand gripped her shoulder from behind, firm and reassuring. Robert stood beside her, his face pale before flushing deep red. He'll pay for this," the boy muttered hoarsely. The sheriff gave a slow nod. "He'll hang before the month's out. But we need you. Your testimony ties it all together." Marianne inhaled shakily, then nodded. "I'll do it. If it saves others, if it stops him from hurting anyone else, I'll do it." On the day of the trial, all three of them went down the mountain together. Marianne rode with Grace nestled in her arms, her chest heavy thinking of the other girls. Some younger, some weaker, who hadn't made it through. The courthouse was packed, faces full of quiet pain and determined defiance. When her turn came, Marianne stood straight, her voice ringing clear as she looked directly at the man who had brought her into this world and sold her out of it. "You sold me," she said, her words echoing in the chamber, "because you thought I was worthless. But you were wrong. I was, and I am, worth more than that. We all are, every one of us." The whispers in the room died away. Her father never looked up. When the judge read the death sentence, Marianne felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness for every life his choices had damaged, including her own. As she stepped outside afterward, a young girl approached. Her face was still marred by fresh scars, her dark eyes wary yet searching. She murmured a shy thank you. Marianne bent slightly, her voice gentle. "What's your name?" "Sarah," the girl whispered. Marianne glanced toward Samuel and Robert waiting on the steps, then back at Sarah. Her expression softened. "How'd you feel about life on a mountain, Sarah? It's safe up there. And I could use another pair of hands with this little one." Sarah blinked, stunned, before giving the smallest nod, a faint spark lighting in her eyes. Marianne knew her own story wasn't over, but she could at least start making it right, for herself, for her daughter, and now for others like Sarah, too. Marianne's wedding came on a crisp May morning, the Appalachian sky a brilliant blue, wildflowers blooming across the hillside. Spring air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, freshly awakened from the long winter. On top of a small hill overlooking the valley, Samuel had cleared a patch of ground, set up a rough wooden table and a few benches. There were no trumpets, no white gown, no grand decorations. Yet Marianne had never felt more beautiful or certain. Standing there in the deep blue dress her mother had left her, lovingly altered by her own hands. Samuel stood waiting, his leather coat catching the sun, his gray eyes never leaving hers as she walked toward him. Grace nestled in her arms, each step sure and steady along the flower-strewn path. Robert stood just behind Samuel, wearing a freshly pressed shirt, his young face alight with pride. Sarah stood on the other side, cradling Grace with quiet care as Marianne reached the top of the hill. The old preacher clasped his hands, and his warm, steady voice rose above the mountain breeze. The vows were simple, yet carried more weight than any Marianne had ever imagined. When the preacher asked, "Do you take this man as your husband, to walk through storms and poverty together for all the days of your life?" she looked up at Samuel, into those gray eyes where she saw everything she'd ever longed for. Protection, steadfastness, and a love he rarely spoke but always showed. "I do," she answered, her voice clear and unwavering. When Samuel leaned down and kissed her, his hair brushed her cheek, his hand squeezed hers tight, and she knew. This was what she'd been searching for all along, through every loss, a true family. The little celebration that followed was modest but warm. Around the crackling fire, laughter rose into the mountain night. Robert clumsily tried to cheat at cards as Sarah pretended not to notice, both of them breaking into carefree laughter. Samuel sat close beside Marianne, his arm around her shoulders, his eyes softening every time he glanced at Grace sleeping peacefully in Sarah's arms. Later, when the others had gone quiet, the air alive with the sound of crickets and the soft wind through the trees, Marianne stepped out onto the porch, leaning against Samuel. He stood next to her, his broad hand finding hers. "You happy?" he asked, his low voice rumbling like the mountains themselves. Marianne rested her cheek against his shoulder, feeling his solid warmth, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Happier than I ever dared hope," she whispered. Samuel didn't answer, just pressed a kiss to her hair. She closed her eyes, smiling faintly, letting the quiet of him fill her. And in that moment Marianne understood. She had finally found her home. Not the one she was born into, but the one she had built. Brick by brick, scar by scar, smile by smile. With this man, this child, and these people, her true family. As summer settled over the mountains, wildflowers bloomed in brilliant colors along the hillsides, and golden stalks of rye swayed gently in the sun. Inside the little wooden cabin, there was no longer the heavy shadow of winter. Laughter, the smell of fresh bread, the warm scent of pine and sawdust filled the air, the unmistakable breath of a real home. Marianne stood on the porch, cradling Grace in her arms. The baby was plumper now, her dark eyes wide as she took in the world. Robert was helping Samuel mend the roof of the shed, the boy taller now, his shoulders broader, his gaze steadier. Sarah was in the garden, humming softly as she pulled weeds. In that moment, Marianne knew. This wasn't just a place to hide anymore. This was home, her home. That afternoon, Samuel returned from town carrying a paper-wrapped parcel. He set it quietly on the kitchen table, clearing his throat, his gray eyes holding a look Marianne couldn't quite name. "There's news," he said evenly. "Charles Walker was hanged this morning." "Quick, quiet!" "It's over." Marianne only nodded. Her heart didn't ache anymore, nor did it feel triumphant. It was simply as though a door had quietly closed inside her. She stepped outside into the evening light, holding Grace tightly, and whispered, "It's over, sweetheart. There's nothing left to fear now." That night, as the sun sank and painted the mountains in gold and rose, the little family gathered around the rough wooden table. Samuel was teaching Robert how to count cards while Sarah sat opposite Grace, coaxing the baby into fits of giggles. Marianne watched them, every familiar face lit by the glow of the hearth, and her heart filled with something she'd never dared believe she deserved. Peace. Later, as night settled over the peaks and cool forest air drifted in, Marianne leaned her head on Samuel's shoulder, her voice quiet as a breath. "I used to think no one would ever see me as worth anything." Samuel's arm tightened gently around her, his gray eyes soft. "You've always been worth everything," he murmured, "and now you don't have to prove that to anyone anymore." Marianne closed her eyes, smiling faintly as she pressed a kiss to Grace's tiny forehead, feeling the baby's little hand curl around her finger. Out here, in this wild and untamed place, she had found her family. Not the one she was born into, but the one she chose. And in choosing them, she had finally found her freedom.